Mistakes were made. Okay, so George W. Bush, he was famous for saying after the Iraq War, was that 2000, started in 2001, I think, into 2003 or something? I'm not sure. But instead of taking responsibility, instead of I made a mistake, his rhetoric, his speech was mistakes were made. So it's a clever way of removing responsibility. So the passive voice is certainly stylistic. It is stylistic. That means as in it depends on you whether you want to use it or not. There's no rule to say you have to use it. It's a case of do you want to use it? In this case, George W. Bush, he definitely wanted to avoid saying I, because I makes him responsible for the mistakes. Whereas in this case, he's just saying that mistakes, by the way, are like errors. They are like bad decisions. Bad decisions were made. By who? He's not specifying who did it. Just do it is the Nike slogan. Nike, not Nike, it's Nike. Comes from the Greek god Nike. You should read the book on Nike. It's really good. Anyway, just do it. Active. It's the active voice. It's do it. You do it. It's not just make sure it is done. By who? So in marketing, you can just compare the number of syllables here. 1, 2, 3. Is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it takes twice as long to say something in the passive voice than it does in the active voice. It takes, I repeat, twice as long. It takes twice as many words. Therefore, it takes us twice as much time. So in marketing, they want to get to the point. Marketing generally uses the active voice. Just do it. So here are some more examples. The tour is led by professional guides. The tour, the route, is led, as in the leaders, by who? By professional guides. Number 2, the artifact was probably made in what is now modern-day Bolivia. So focusing here on the object, the artifact, the object. The violent criminal has been detained by the police. The violent criminal. He's the object. He's receiving the action by the police. The action of detaining. To detain is to put somebody into the jail, as in to take away their freedom. That is to detain. So the police detain violent criminals. And that fourth example, mistakes were made again. So let's look at the meaning here. Number 1, we generally use the passive voice if we want to emphasize or put emphasis on the object. So the receiver of the action. So in this case, what's more interesting? Professional guides or the Inca Trail? tell you what, the Inca Trail is very famous. The guides are less important. The Inca Trail is more important. So we want to emphasize the object. However, the Inca Trail is not leading anyone. It is led. It's not, the Inca Trail itself is not leading. The guides are leading. But what are they leading? They are leading the tour, the Inca Trail. Number two, we don't know who does the action. Okay, in this case, in the past, we don't know who did the action, who made this artifact. By who? We don't know by who. The artifact was probably made in Bolivia by some indigenous people, but we don't really know who. It doesn't say. If it said made by Homer Simpson, then we would know it was made by Homer Simpson. So Homer Simpson made the artifact, but in this case, we don't know. So we have the passive voice. The object was made by, we don't know who. It's number three, it's obvious who's doing the action. It's obvious. So in this case, the police it's pretty obvious. You wouldn't need to put by the police. It's so obvious. So we don't need to actually put the action, the person who did the action. The fire was extinguished. The fire was put out. Well, who puts out fires? Right, the firefighters. It's obvious. And finally, we want to avoid talking about the action taker. So that was the stylistic, which I mentioned before. Stylistic prose. I don't want to be mentioned, so I'm going to shift the perspective. That is what you would expect politicians to do, I suspect. What's important though, some verbs can't be made into the passive voice because they don't have an object. So this is more technically known as transitive versus intransitive verbs. For example, intransitive verbs versus transitive verbs. It's, for example, verbs that take an object, it's okay. I play games. Yeah, because there is an object after the verb. Yeah. What do you play? Oh, I play games. What do you play? Games. However, in this case, I remember is not okay because there's no object. Oh yeah, I remember. So I remember the boy. The boy was remembered. Doesn't make sense. Games were played. In ancient Roman times, games were played by many of the population. I remember cannot go. So those kind of stative verbs, intransitive versus transitive. So it's very important to know the difference. So how do we actually form it? To form the passive voice, we take the receiver of the action, that means the object, and we put it at the beginning of the sentence. Okay, so we switch it around, basically. So if you look here, I made a cake. I made a cake. Who's doing the action? Who's making the cake? Well, me, I am. And what am I making? I'm making the cake. So here's the subject. The subject is the one doing the verb, and the object is the one of essentially receiving the verb, the result of the verb, of the action. The cake. What do you make? You make a cake. Who makes it? I make it. So if we're going to change that, that's the active voice. If we're going to change it to the passive voice, we take a cake and we shift it over here to the front of the sentence, structure, flip it around, and we add the verb to be. Now, in this case, in the past. I made a cake in the past. So a cake was made, and that could be it. That would be enough. If you want to know who did it, who did the action, you add the by phrase. By phrase. So by him, by her, by me, by the wonderful, sophisticatedly talented elephant who made the cake. Just kidding. Elephants don't make cakes, do they? But they do paint. So you could say the elephant made, maybe the elephant painted a picture. A picture was painted by an elephant. Okay, that's the example I want you to think in your mind, to imagine in the future. Oh, passive voice. Oh, a painting was painted by an elephant. I'm sure with that kind of imagery in your head, if you really imagine it, you'll never forget the passive voice. So, for example, in the present, we sometimes use the passive voice, or the passive voice is sometimes used by us. So we do have to add the verb to be and change to the past participle. However, it works fine. And it works fine for the past, the same. We often used, now in the past, the passive voice. So the passive voice was often used by us. I could give you another one in the future. We will play football. Football will be played. So there's no problem using the past, the present, or the future with the passive voice. Totally flexible. So I want you to review these ones. See if you can have a go. Give it a shot. Try your best to change these sentences, very simple sentences, to the passive voice. I made cakes. I made a cake. I will make a cake. I will have made a cake. I can make a cake. In the chat, okay, it's come up anyway. So I made cakes. Cakes are made. By who? By me. Cakes are made. And this is in general. I make cakes. Cakes are made. In general, it's the present tense. I made a cake, the past tense. A cake was made. So in reality, what changes here, as you will begin to see, is not the verb, but the verb to be. Not the main verb, but the auxiliary verb, the helping verb, the verb to be. Made, 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 made. Cake, 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 cake. This is what changes here, the verb to be. So I made a cake. I will make a cake. A cake will be made. I have made a cake. A cake has been made. I can make a cake. A cake can be made. So you can see here it also works with modal verbs as well. So what's my advice? My advice is to generally avoid the passive voice. It can be confusing. It's not direct, it's kind of indirect, and that is what makes it confusing. The active voice is clearer and easier to understand. It's shorter, like we saw it, like I said, it's shorter, it's more concise, it's clearer, it's easier to understand. I'll leave you with a quote. The active voice is usually more direct and vigorous than the passive. Okay? More direct and vigorous. That means it has more impact. This is why in marketing, it's better to use the active voice. It's more direct. So well done for completing that one. That's everything you need to know about the passive voice. Ta-ra! Or should I come up with something? This module has been completed. This module on the passive voice has now been completed by you. Well done.
Learning English superiorly. We're gonna learn English quick.